Hi, I'm at Marmel on Twitter, and you're listening to Two Broads Talking Politics. Neat, right?
Hi everyone, this is Kelly with Two Broads Talking Politics, and I'm here with Jennifer Cohn, who is an election integrity advocate and researcher and writer, and also an attorney. Hi Jennifer.
Hi Kelly.
Thanks so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
Let's start. We are talking on Monday, March 25th, and over the weekend, some news broke.
Sure did.
Yeah. So on Friday, Mueller wrapped up his investigation and delivered a report to Barr, Attorney General Barr. And then Barr, was that just yesterday, released a letter, 4-page letter, not very long, that has been made public that sort of summarizes the findings of the investigation.
Right.
So I guess this is all, of course, a little bit of speculation on our part, so I'll preface with that, but we'll talk about what we do know. Were you surprised that the investigation was wrapping up when it was?
No, I wasn't particularly surprised. The whole Russia investigation has not, it's been on my radar, but I haven't followed it as closely, I think, as some people. And no, I wasn't surprised. Were you?
I wasn't surprised exactly. It did feel like there were still threads that were hanging that, having not read the actual report, however long it might be, it's unclear whether some of that was finished or not. Seems like, the Stone trial hasn't happened yet. And so who knows what's going on with all of that. But no.
Yeah, my main overall feeling on the developments around the report is frustration, because I see this 4-page memo from Barr as propaganda, a pretty standard type of propaganda that's called cherry picking or card stacking, where you try to persuade an audience of a particular point of view by not presenting the complete story. And a perfect example of that, I was just reading about it yesterday, was an example would be like you have a study showing that eating peanut butter causes liver cancer, but then you omit that a later study showed that the original study was flawed and that it was funded by the peanut butter haters and therefore it's suspect. I don't think anyone should really be commenting on Barr's memo other than to say that that we need to see the complete report. It's very easy to create false impressions by cherry picking out of cherry picking your facts. And as others have pointed out, there's almost not a single complete sentence, or maybe there literally is not a single complete sentence from the original report that's made it into Barr's 4-page memo.
And Barr, we should remember, is an attorney. He's probably not outright lied at any point in his letter, because presumably he knows that at some point the whole thing could become public, and so lying whether or not he wanted to would be a very bad idea. But it's very easy to be very careful with language and create an impression of...
You can very much mislead with cherry picking. And I think the other thing that frustrates me a bit, although I guess special counsel was appointed specifically to figure out if the campaign coordinated with Russia, I think that the definition of campaign, I'd sort of like to know how that was defined, because it's pretty obvious, and I thought relatively beyond dispute, that Cambridge Analytica had very close ties to people in Russia, and also, according to Christopher Wiley, he was the Cambridge Analytica whistleblower. He had said long ago that they hired Russian hackers, or people who were known to be Russian hackers. And I don't know if they hired them to do hacking, but certainly people from Russia. And there were people in Russia who accessed Cambridge Analytica's data. And of course, Cambridge Analytica did both Trump's campaign and Brexit. And I think there's really, by making it all about whether Trump and his literal campaign joined with Russia, we sort of missed the bigger point, which is we need to see the report to prevent a repeat in 2020 of what happened in 2016 in terms of propaganda and disinformation. And it's really cyber warfare because Cambridge Analytica's software that UK literally, its software was literally classified as weapons grade in the United Kingdom because they previously used it for the Defense Department to maybe combat ISIS and that sort of thing. And it was never intended originally to be deployed against against American citizens or in the UK against UK citizens. So I don't know. I think we really need to see the report sort of regardless of whether Mueller was able to find sufficient proof that Trump himself intended to conspire with Russia.
Yeah, I find it, I find much of what Trump does distasteful, of course, but I find it very distasteful to be like, yay, look, I'm not at fault, and to ignore yes, but Russia was trying to influence our election.
To help him, right.
That seems like a really important point, whether or not you were part of it, that we should get to the bottom of.
Yeah, and I think that the public needs to know what Mueller did to investigate some of these threads. Like, what did he do to investigate Cambridge Analytica's ties to Russia? And maybe there were reasons he wasn't able to find sufficient evidence. Because remember, there was some bank or some foreign company that wouldn't cooperate with his investigation, and we don't even know who that is. And someone a while ago asked me, because they were going to be having an online debate about Russian collusion and what I thought the strongest evidence of it was. And I think there was a lot of circumstantial evidence, but as far as direct evidence, two things that really stood out to me was the Cambridge Analytica ties, and also that potentially that Alpha Bank communication with the Trump Tower server, and I think it was in Michigan and Pennsylvania. And the New Yorker, it was debunked initially, but then the New Yorker ran a story that kind of undebunked it. And the FBI apparently went in and, according to the New Yorker article, and obtained evidence from a company called ListTrack from where the server was located in Pennsylvania. And I think the public deserves to know what those communications were about. I won't be able to let it rest without finding out. And if it literally was nothing, I want to know that, and I want to know how they figured that out. Whether it's something or nothing, it's certainly an unusual activity that more than justified concern on the part of the public, and we're entitled to know, we deserve to know as American citizens what was done to determine that it was nothing, if that was the determination.
So then let's talk about ways we can try to make sure that future elections are not hacked or are unhackable. So one of the things that you work on quite a lot, and you're sort of the go-to source for this now, is this idea of our voting machines and how secure the voting machines themselves are or not, and what sorts of things could be done, whether or not we have any proof of things that were done, things that could be done with these machines. So could you sort of bring us up to speed where we are right now in terms of what sorts of voting machines are being looked at by various counties around the country, and what machines they're purchasing and the problems with those?
Sure. So before about 2 years ago, the country, I think the majority used hand-marked paper ballots counted on optical scanners. That was the majority of the country by maybe 60% or so, or maybe even as high as 70%. And then some of the country, a very large, smaller portion, used touchscreen voting machines. Some of those are completely paperless, and some of them have what's called a paper audit trail, which is like a cash register receipt that gets rolled out. And studies showed long ago that nobody looks at those things and that they can't really be effectively audited. But that's where we were about 2 years ago. And then in the past, most jurisdictions had bought this equipment back around 2002 when it was called the Help America Vote Act, allocated billions of dollars to buy new voting equipment, or at least a lot of it was bought back then. So now the equipment's really old, and everyone has been calling for upgrades, which would be good news, except that unfortunately a lot of jurisdictions are making terrible decisions in terms of security, in terms of what to actually upgrade with, what type of equipment to buy. And that's more to your direct question, what are they looking at? So they're looking at two things primarily. One is scanners for counting hand-marked paper ballots, which would be the better option from an election security standpoint. The other thing that a lot of jurisdictions are looking at that is much less secure is they're called ballot marking devices, and they look a lot like touchscreen voting machines because they're touchscreens. And this is just another system that puts a machine between the voter and the paper printout of their ballot. In this instance, they call the printouts, the vendors call them paper ballots, which is itself vendor propaganda because it has lulled a lot of people, including a lot of election insiders, into thinking these things are as secure as a hand-marked paper ballot. Really, it's caused a lot of people to equate the two. And it's very dangerous because behind the scenes, cybersecurity experts have been sounding the alarm for some time that these things are actually not as secure as hand-marked paper ballot systems. So those are sort of the two things.
So what are some of the ways that they're not as secure? What are things that, if there was a party, if it's either somebody from outside, somebody from Russia or something, or somebody within the, election apparatus of a county, what are some of the ways that they could alter votes using these machines?
Okay, well, first of all, like I said, studies had already shown with the voter verifiable paper audit trails that no one really looks at them. A recent study suggests that the same thing is true now of these paper printouts that they're calling paper ballots. So what someone could do is program or hack the machine. So it could be an insider, right, or a hacker, to flip, say, every seventh vote or every eighth vote or make it a little bit random looking. And chances are, especially as to anything past the president and vice president, that no one would notice. And even those who did notice would just think that they had made a mistake, which is pretty much what happened in the midterm elections with regular voting machines. When people saw them flipping, election officials said that it was probably just user error. So you could pretty safely do that. And in fact, the chairman of the Ohio Democratic Party wrote a fictionalized but very realistic book about Russian hackers doing just that. And the book came out just before the election. It's called The People's House. And I thought it really drove it home for me because it is realistic fiction, and it was based on the studies that show that nobody really looks at these voter verifiable paper audit trails, and that was the idea. They were flipping like every seventh one. So you could certainly do that with these systems. And on top of it, there have been a lot of reports of Russians and people in China being able to hack our grid, our power grid. So certainly, if the power grid was hacked, if you're putting a touch screen machine between voters and their ballots, people may not be able to vote at all. And you could also have targeted what are called denial of service attacks, where it only happens in the jurisdictions of the bad actor's choice. So again, preventing people from voting at all. The other thing with these things, with anytime you put a touchscreen machine between voters and their ballots, is it allows corrupt officials to manufacture long lines, which we have tended to see in blue jurisdictions, blue counties. And the way that they do that is when you use a touchscreen, the number of people who can vote at once is necessarily limited by the number of working touchscreens that are sent to the polling place. And so you can just happen to have the broken down touchscreens, or with the newer equipment, they're called ballot marking devices, but they're also touchscreens. You can just happen to have those be the ones that are sent to certain jurisdictions. And then on top of it, a lot of these machines have something that these ballot marking devices, the printout has a barcode on it, and the barcode is adding an extra. There already were all of these, they call them attack vectors, potential targets for malevolent actors to alter election outcomes. The barcode is what's actually counted as your vote, and people can't read barcodes, and the barcodes are proprietary anyway, so even if you were to bring in your phone, which a lot of people ask me about, no, it wouldn't be able to translate the barcode. And so they can really have the barcode say whatever you want. And the truth is that by 2020, we are probably not going to have meaningful manual audits in most of these jurisdictions, if any of them. And so really the barcodes just would make it easy, frankly, to flip an election. Then on top of it, I've discovered more recently a new type of, it's also a ballot marking device, but they put the ballot marking device, that's that touch screen that marks your ballot for you, puts between you and the piece of paper. They'll call it a paper ballot. They call it paper ballots. It's called a hybrid. So it puts that ballot marking device and a scanner, combines it into a single machine. So it actually looks it is really just like a regular voting machine that we're used to and that has been so maligned by election security experts. And what's especially alarming is that in some of the most traditionally corrupt, in terms of voting rights, corrupt jurisdictions, they're buying these things that are called hybrids, which have an option for voters to not even print up to review that piece of paper at all. And not only that, the machines don't mark the paper printout, the paper ballot at all until that decision is made, it's called autocast, whether to submit it without reviewing the paper. So basically, it makes it very, very easy for the machines to be programmed or hacked to flip only those paper ballots for voters who choose not to review the machine-marked ballot. And that is undetectable in a manual audit. And it's really scary because we've been told a lot of election integrity groups have led us to believe that manual audits are going to be our saving glory in 2020. And number one, we're probably not going to have them in most jurisdictions, not meaningful ones. And number two, even if we did, it won't mean anything because an election could be flipped without detection in a manual audit by changing the paper trail, the paper ballots themselves, in this way with this autocast feature. It's called permission to cheat by some election experts. It's really bad. And and Georgia just passed a law that would allow the purchase of those for the entire state.
You had done an article, and I'll post that article on our website too, so people can read that. It's a really good explanation of what's going on. And so Georgia seems like a perennial problem with voting. Yes. We certainly saw that in 2018. Are there other places that you would in particular tell people to be very careful and be talking to their whoever in their state or their county is in charge of purchasing? What are the places that you would be particularly concerned about?
That include counties that are buying these hybrid machines with the permission to cheat. I don't want to minimize the problem with the regular kind of ballot marking device, the regular kind of barcode ballot marking device, but the barcode hybrids take it to another level. They're both terrible, both of them. But in particular, the hybrid, the states that have counties that have bought these hybrids or seem to be considering them: Ohio, Pennsylvania, Texas, Kansas, New Jersey, New York, Delaware, and Georgia. And I'm told that Maryland is passing a law that may allow ballot marking devices as a primary voting system, which presumably would include these hybrids as well. And frankly, if you live in any swing state, I think you need to look at this. I don't care where you live. I think you need to make sure that they're not buying barcode ballot marking devices or hybrids. And you need to make noise about it. And I think it's important to document it, because whether you stop it now or later, it's important that that these jurisdictions that are buying them have been on notice of the problems before the election is actually conducted, in case someone does at some point want to conduct or want to challenge an election outcome. I think it's really, really important that we at least create that record.
So what are the specific actions that you would recommend people take?
I think emailing your member of Congress, emailing your state lawmakers, so figure out who your state representatives are and your state senators, and emailing them saying that you want hand-marked paper ballots and that you do not want the machine-marked paper ballots from hackable ballot marking devices. I think that's really an important message. Your county election official, I think you email them as well, and you could send them my article, which that would be great if you would post it to your site. The title focuses on the hybrids, but it actually includes also a discussion of the non-hybrid ones and the dangers of those as well, because they're both very dangerous. So I think you do that. The one member of Congress who I know understands the dangers of these new ballot marking devices as a primary voting system is Ron Wyden, and he has an election security bill called the PAVE Act, which is better than any of the other ones. I don't want to say that it's perfect because it still would allow jurisdictions to buy these ballot marking devices as a primary system, but it does require at least that they also give voters the option to hand mark their ballots. So you can support his PAVE Act. I think amplifying the importance of hand-marked paper ballots and always specify hand-marked. Start using that hashtag on social media. And I did a call to action the other day, which you were nice enough to amplify, which has to do with a petition that's circulating that I'll have at the top of my timeline at least through this week. It's up to 6,000 signatures now. It's to get the House Oversight Committee to look into Georgia's new anticipated voting machine purchase, because they are very clearly leaning toward, I think, probably the hybrids, but if not the hybrids, then the barcode ballot marking devices. And they have done so despite really an onslaught of cybersecurity experts, scientists, telling them that this is a dangerous purchase. It's very well documented. They're very much on notice of the dangers. And not only that, it's a much more expensive system. It costs about at least 2 times as much as using hand-marked paper ballots would. And it appears that there's, at a minimum, flagrant corruption behind the decision involving this vendor named ES&S, which is Georgia's current vendor. And if ES&S were a person, that person would wear a red MAGA hat, because they have donated $30,000 to the Republican State Leadership Committee, and they just have a lot of strong Republican ties. Kemp made ES&S's top lobbyist in the state his chief of staff recently. So the House subcommittee was already investigating voter suppression in the state, and it is actually looking into voting machine irregularities that occurred during the midterms, which is huge to have them take that seriously. And this vendor ES&S accounts for 44% of U.S. election equipment. So whether you're in Georgia or not, to have the House investigating ES&S's equipment and Georgia's decision to buy, insistence really, it was the Republicans, lawmakers, their insistence on buying this equipment despite all the warnings from security experts, it would be huge. And so it's a petition to make sure that they focus not just on it's big, but to focus not just on the irregularities that occurred in 2018, but also on this new equipment purchase, which is happening, as I said, really throughout the country. So this could be our gateway into actually finally getting some answers, because the House has subpoena power. And until now, we've had nobody with subpoena power to look into this, and it would take a subpoena to actually find out if there have been kickbacks or bribes, or really just what's going on. Why are so many jurisdictions insisting on buying these things when there is a public outcry? Because it was a huge public outcry in Georgia, but there have been public outcries in Philadelphia as well, which insisted on buying these. And in Johnson County, Kansas, the largest county in Kansas, most populous, there was also an outcry and an insistence by election officials to go with this insecure equipment.
Okay, so we will make sure that we post the link to your article and also a link to this petition so people can sign on to that. And I think, in addition to writing to your members of Congress and your state representatives, it would be great to have letters to the editor in lots of newspapers about this too. I think that this is just a thing that people aren't even thinking about unless they're the super activists like us. So it'd be great to get a lot more people knowledgeable about this. And
I think it's really important to message that it is no longer enough to say paper ballots, because the vendors have successfully changed the meaning of paper ballot to include these machine-marked printouts from hackable touchscreens. So now you have to say hand-marked.
Is it a good idea for people who are in places with these kind of machines to try to vote by mail if they can? Is that something that you would recommend?
Ideally, what you want is to make sure they allow you to vote by hand-marked paper ballot at the polling place, I think. Vote by mail has a lot of chain of custody problems, and especially if you're in one of these traditional voter suppression states. They do things with the signature. They'll just determine that your signature doesn't match what your signature looked like 15 years ago and toss it out. And the way that they can do this, in part, is based on the zip code on your envelope or your last name. If you have an ethnic-sounding last name, they can have a pretty good idea of what way you're voting and selectively toss that out. So I don't really recommend vote by mail except as a final last alternative that is better than using these machine mark printouts. Yes, it's better than that. But try to hand mark at the polling place. And some jurisdictions will let you do that. So even if your jurisdiction has already bought this crap, these touchscreen barcode ballot marking devices or hybrids, even if they've already bought that, it's not over. You still put them on notice using my article. I don't think there's another one out there yet of what the cybersecurity experts are saying about the dangers, and you insist that they provide hand-marked paper ballots at the polling place, which they should be doing anyway, even if they don't agree with those cyber experts, just on the possibility that there will be power outages. Mm-hmm. They should be providing those at the polls anyway. And you fight for that, and you promote that, and you tell other people that's what they should do, that they should request and use hand-marked paper ballots at the polls.
All right. And right now is the time to do it. While there's still lots of time before the 2019 elections for states that have 2019 and a lot of time before 2020. So now is when we should be focusing on this.
That's right.
All right. Well, Jenny, thank you so much for joining me again on the podcast. And I hope people will follow you on Twitter. You're constantly beating the drum on this sort of stuff. And it's so useful and so important for people to stay informed on.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you for having me on the show. I think you said my Twitter handle, but just in case, it's at Jenny Cohn 1, JennyCohn1. And I will put that petition at the top of my timeline.
Excellent. Well, Jenny, thank you. And everybody else, make sure you go and write to your members of Congress and make sure everyone you know knows about what's going on and that they should be requesting hand-marked paper ballots.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for listening to Two Broads Talking Politics. Our theme song is called Are You Listening? Off of the album Elephant Shaped Trees by the band Immunuri, and we're using it with permission of the band. Our logo and other original artwork is by Matthew Weflin and was created for use by this podcast.